a.m. in Boston, where Charles, one of our keynote speakers, is dialing in from. So hello to everybody and a very warm welcome to the Curriculum in a Fast Changing World seminar. It's brought to you by the National Education Collaboration Trust. I am Shirley Eady from the innovation unit called the Ed Hub within the NECT. And joining us today, we've got a range of different people that are involved in curriculum: experts, contributors, participants in the curriculum, and enthusiasts. We've got people joining us from all 9 provinces in South Africa at various levels of government, as well as a range of key stakeholders. And it's great to have so many people together to join us for this conversation. Many of you are returning from a dialogue on a very similar topic in 2018 that we hosted, also looking at curriculum in a fast changing world and really honing in on the need for improving the relevance of our curriculum in an environment that is not only changing, but changing exponentially at a faster rate as we progress. So this need for relevance has been one that has been a real focus of the curriculum. So today, what hasn't changed is that the need for relevance remains, and we need to continue exploring how to improve the relevance of the South African curriculum. But of course, what has changed dramatically is that schooling has been turned upside down in 2020. And all of a sudden, there's short-term urgency around addressing how do we catch up all of our learners, and what does curriculum trimming look like? As we all know, most of our learners have lost around 6 months, if not more, of schooling this year due to school closures, but also when they get back to school, because of social distancing measures, the ability to learn effectively is reduced, and the ability to have educators in front of and with learners at any given time is significantly reduced. Also, learning opportunity has been dramatically unequal during this time for reasons that we're all very familiar with. So there's a lot of concerning stats out there around what the implications of COVID have been on education. This conversation is not about that. This conversation is looking forward about solutions. And today's conversation is really aimed at addressing how the current urgent need for curriculum trimming and learning catch-up can be approached to ensure that learners are, on the one hand, equipped with the knowledge, skills, and competencies during and after the pandemic, whilst simultaneously using it as an opportunity to gear our curriculum for future relevance in a fast-changing world. So welcome everybody. I can still hear that there are people arriving. A very warm welcome to our speakers, whom our facilitator, John Volmink, will be introducing soon. John, we're delighted to have you here today. Many of you, in fact, I'll be surprised if anyone doesn't know Prof. John Volmink, who is one of our education warriors and a long-standing participant in the creation and the evolution of curriculum in South Africa. John, thank you so much for joining us today. Before I hand over to you, John, I'd just like to provide an apology for Godwin Kosa, the CEO of the NECT, who would like to be here today, but is in a parallel meeting, so he might pop onto the call at some point, and we've invited him to raise his voice at any point that he'd like to, if he is able to join. In terms of meeting etiquette, we'd ask everyone please to mute your microphones and turn off your videos. When we get to the question and answer sections, please do raise your hand prior to asking questions, and we will take 3 questions at a time. And if we run out of time today, please post your comments on the Q&A section. Following this seminar, we will follow up with a document that summarizes the key themes and also a set of recommendations that can be provided to the department for consideration. The speakers have quite tight time slots today, so they'll be moving relatively quickly, and we thank John for taking us through the session. Thank you, John. Over to you.
Thank you, Shirley. And good day, everyone. In particular, welcome to our 2 guest speakers, Sarah Grafford as well as Charles Fidel. It's wonderful to have you, and I'll introduce you in a few minutes. As Shirley said, this session is about curriculum in a fast-changing world. And so I want to start with a story, and I'm going to ask Catherine to put up a picture of a bridge. It's a story of a bridge. And okay, we'll get the bridge in a minute. But this is a remarkable story of that bridge. Some of you may know the story, but that is a bridge in Honduras. And it is a bridge over a river, the Choluteca River. And that bridge was built originally in 1930, but the version that you see now was erected by very specialized architects. It's a suspension bridge completed in 1998. And it was particularly important that that bridge could withstand the hurricanes and the fiery hurricanes of that part of the world. And sure enough, a few months after it was erected by the Japanese, a hurricane did come. And all the 7,000 people lost their lives in Honduras. All the bridges in the area were destroyed except one bridge, and that is this bridge over that river. And the story about this is, it's all fine and it's great. The Choluteca Bridge remained fixed and it withstood the storm. Except there was one problem, and that's a problem. What had happened, the hurricane had caused a major disruption to the landscape. And so the river, as you can see, no longer was flowing under the bridge. But the bridge couldn't move. The bridge was inflexible. And that bridge, until today, stands there as a bridge from nowhere to nowhere. We've had a disruption. Even before COVID-19, things started to change quite rapidly in the world. And what we have today is a curriculum with a river flowing around it. And to address this dilemma that we face, we've asked two people to come and speak to us today to help us think through the dilemma. What we don't want is our curriculum being a bridge to nowhere. The first speaker is Professor Sarah Grafford. And she is the Professor of Education and the Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Johannesburg. Her research really focuses on transformative learning, dialogic teaching, and both in higher education, adult education. But in recent times, she has been focusing on teacher preparation and its relevance for a fast-changing world. She's the author of several books, several articles on teaching and learning, but her crowning achievement and joy, she feels, was to establish the University of Johannesburg's Soweto campus. And I must say, ever since I met Sarah, I promised to come there, but I've not found the time yet. But it is a wonderful example of what a university should be in relation to its to the other institutions. So, Sarah, I invite you to address us.
Thank you, John. I will be switching off my video soon as the slides are available, so I see them, so I'm switching off my video now. So good day, and thank you very much, colleagues, for this opportunity. My interest in curriculum in a fast-changing world stems mainly from my research focus on teacher education. Move to the next slide, please. Central to my work is a tension between the current, the local, the contextual, the perennial in education, and the unpredictability of the future. And this is complicated even further by the agreement that technological advancements will exponentially accelerate change. Now, all of this points to the issue of relevance of teacher education in these complex times. Just giving you a sense of some of the work that I'm involved in, and the work is done also in collaboration with students, and many of those students are also staff. So we are focusing, for instance, on lesson design in pre-service teacher education. We are doing some work on teacher development for using play for competencies for a changing world. We're looking at the professional development of student teachers through coding, and in this instance specifically using Scratch, with a view to understand how this coding platform can assist with deepening curriculum learning and also developing creativity. Interesting one, final year student teachers' views of an ideal teacher for a fast changing world, and then pre-service teachers' incorporation of robotics into lesson design. I also am involved in the sandbox project of the NECT. It's to work with the colleagues in this project. And in this project, we focus on the fast changing world, but specifically looking at schooling needs. Can move to the next slide, please. The summary of my presentation is as follows. I will start with the vision that was expressed by the Minister of Basic Education, Minister Mutshekga, on 22 July 2020 about the post-COVID-19 curriculum. I will then ask the question whether there is a shared understanding of the terminology, skills and competencies for a changing world. Thereafter, I will say something about literacies for a changing world. I will also ask what the IBE framework is in relation to the vision of the post-COVID-19 curriculum. And lastly, I will invoke the notion of life-worthiness and life-readiness as put forward by David Perkins from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Next slide, please. The Minister of Basic Education indicated that the vision of the post-COVID-19 basic education is anchored on the immediate implementation of a curriculum with skills and competencies for a changing world. My question, immediate, what does immediate mean? Has the curriculum development work been done, or is the development at an advanced stage? Is this for all grades? How soon will immediate be? Will teachers be ready? How will they be supported? Are time frames realistic? And then the minister used the nomenclature of skills and competencies for a changing world. My question, is this now the accepted terminology within the DBE? And if so, is there a widely shared understanding of how the terms skills and competencies are used? I'm asking this because when one reads the literature on skills and competencies for a changing world, also referred to by some as 21st century skills and competencies, it is bewildering because different meanings are attached to in different skills and competency frameworks and contexts. Here are some examples. The OEC definition of competency is that it is more than just knowledge and skills, and then explanation, and then the example is given. For example, to communicate effectively is a competency that may draw on an individual's knowledge of language, practical IT skills, and attitudes to those with whom he or she is communicating. This is the OECD. The work of Pellegrino and Hilton is about developing transferable knowledge and skills in the 21st century. And they explain the notion of transferable knowledge to include content knowledge and skills. And skills involve how, why, and when to apply knowledge, to answer questions and solve problems. And the blend of content knowledge and related skills are the 21st century competencies. Next slide, please. Now, the Center for Curriculum Redesign developed the 4-dimensional education framework, and Charles is here today, so you can ask him questions about this framework. And this framework consists of knowledge, skills, character, and meta-learning. And knowledge refers to what we know and understand, and the other dimensions are competencies. Now, the way I understand it, competency includes skills, include character, meta-learning, is also included. In other words, competencies involve a mix of social, emotional, and cognitive capabilities, and skills are a type of competency. The International Bureau of Education does not refer to competencies or skills, but focuses on the notion of competence and competences. And the definition that is given for competence is the developmental capacity to interactively mobilize and ethically use information, data, knowledge, skills, values, attitudes, and technology to engage effectively and act across diverse 21st century contexts to attain individual, collective, and global good. So the point that I'm trying to make here is a clarity on nomenclature and what specific terms are important, because nomenclature inadvertently steers thinking, conversation, and practice. Terminology and or nomenclature is important. Next slide, please. I also wish to briefly pose a question about literacies for a changing world. So my question is, how does the notion of skills and competencies for a changing world account for the literacies that are important for a changing world? For example, digital literacy, information literacy, and science literacy. Or is the assumption that the notion of skills and competencies for a changing world include these? Now, I want to make it I'm not saying that the Department of Basic Education in its plans and actions does not focus on these literacies. I'm trying to make the point that are we bringing in the notion of these literacies when we are referring to skills and competencies for a changing world? Now, the significance of some of these literacies has been underscored by the COVID-19 pandemic. Recent posting in the World Economic Forum COVID Action Platform, for example, claims that many of the problems resulting from the COVID-19 crisis are related to a lack of science literacy. Now, the authors argue that science literacy must be added in the basic definition of literacy to empower the next generation to address global challenges and also to counteract the denial of scientific knowledge and to actively fight misinformation. And we are all aware of the challenge that we have currently with COVID-19 in relation to the denial of scientific knowledge and misinformation. And this also underscores the importance of information literacy to understand the difference between trustworthy information and invalid information from social media. I also want to make a case here to explicitly include the foundational literacies in conversations about competencies for a changing world. To bring it in, these foundational literacies, make them part of the conversation. And why do I say so? The foundational literacies are central to a focus on skills and competencies for a changing world. Because of their fundamental nature, they form the foundation for success in education. Some say that we should focus in education on getting the basics right, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the so-called 3 R's. I don't have an issue with that. They say that we do not have the luxury to divert attention to competencies for a changing world. Our children can't read and do basic maths. My counter argument is first that the foundational literacies are integral to competencies for a changing world because they are foundational. So there is no need to juxtapose foundational literacies and competencies for a changing world. And secondly, my argument is that foregrounding the foundational literacies does not need to preclude cultivating other competencies that children will need to negotiate the changing world. My sense is, and my argument is, that children may acquire basic literacies more effectively in an education environment that nurtures, for example, the 4 C's: critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And yes, I would make the case even for young children. And here I want to bring in the notion of leapfrogging, drawing on the work of Rebecca Winthrop. The work indicates that leapfrogging implies any practices, both old and new, that can address skills inequality and skills uncertainty at the same time. Leapfrogging breaks from the well-established logic of prioritizing first, for example, access to school, second, academic quality, and third, real-world relevance. And I would add, relevance for now and the future. Thank you. Move on to the next slide. So having focused on the discourse around competencies, which could be, as I said, be quite bewildering, and then also having focused on literacies for a changing world, my next point is about the role of the IBE framework of future competences. Now, the Department of Basic Education adopted the IBE framework of future competences in 2019 to guide curriculum development. My understanding is that it is not envisaged to develop a fully fledged competence-based curriculum in line with what the IBE framework proposes. The IBE framework proposes structuring the curriculum around competences and not around subjects. And what I gathered from the statement from the minister is that that is not the plan. And maybe the colleagues from the Department of Basic Education will shed light on this today. If I am correct in this, my question then would be, what exactly would the role of the IBE framework be? In relation to competences, the framework includes 7 macro competences, namely lifelong learning, self-agency, interactively using diverse tools and resources, interacting with others, interacting with the world, multiliteratedness, and transdisciplinarity. And then each of these 7 macro competences include different micro competences, but the micro competences are not unpacked in the framework. A few examples are provided. So the IBE wishes its framework to serve as a neutral or generic supra-level framework of future competences. So in the light of this, what is the role of the IBE framework of future competences in relation to the post-COVID-19 envisaged curriculum? The IBE framework does not purport to be a skills and competency framework. Next slide, please. My last point moves away from directly addressing the notion of competencies for a changing world, but still addressing it indirectly. And here I wish to draw on the work of David Perkins from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. David Perkins writes about reimagining the school curriculum to prepare children for a fast-changing world and an uncertain future. He makes a convincing case that school curriculums should be redesigned using what is likely to matter in the lives learners are likely to live, as a core measure, he coins the term life worthiness to encapsulate like this. So the question is, do we have or are we envisaging a life-worthy curriculum? But he also makes the case that knowledge that is life-worthy does not necessarily end up to be life-ready in practice. And this is where teaching practices become very important. The types of practices that enable conversion of life-worthiness to life-readiness are those that aim for meaningful learning and transfer. And teaching for transfer engages learners deeply with learning content and allows for repeated practice and exploration. The point to underscore here is that teaching to enable the likelihood of transfer is time-consuming. Content-crowded curricula do not allow for this. I want to make it clear that I'm not making the case here for a knowledge-thin curriculum. Far from it. I'm making the case for cultivating deep conceptual understanding of the essence or the core ideas of subjects. And then to come back to the vision of the Minister of a post-COVID-19 curriculum, infusing competencies for a changing world into the teaching of core knowledge. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Sarah, for that input. You've raised some fundamental questions, which hopefully we will be able to address some of them in the next few sessions. I just want to convey the greetings of Godwin Kosa. He's in the audience. He's in this room and he's listening to everybody. And he sends his regards to all. And in particular, our next speaker, Charles Fidel. I find Charles Fidel very inspirational, and I have great regard for him as a global education thought leader, an author, a futurist, and an inventor. As we all know and heard Sarah say, he is the founder and chairperson of the Center for Curriculum Redesign in Boston, Massachusetts, and they focus on making education more relevant. The question I think that Sarah started, and hopefully we will continue to hear, is what should students learn for the 21st century? Charles is the project director at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he is also involved in several other projects, including artificial intelligence in education. He's written numerous books, such as the one that was mentioned by Sarah, 4-Dimensional Education. The best-selling book is The 21st Century Skills, and he's working in 30 different countries on curriculum. You know, the first time I heard him, Charles, for me, brought a unique perspective to the world of education. And I'm looking forward very much to hear him share that with us today. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually, and unfortunately only virtually, because I love the beauty of your country and the kindness of its people. I wish I was with you in person next time. So I'm gonna share my screen and proceed. First of all, audio and video check. Are you seeing the presentation, and is my audio uninterrupted?
Yes, Charles. Everything is fine.
Wonderful. Okay, so as John and Sarah mentioned, we're really about making education more relevant. And I have to tell you, sometimes I wish I didn't have the word more, just to make the point a bit more, let's say, sharp on the existing system. So yes, we are a nonprofit. We are about making education more relevant. We started in 2011. I spent 25 years of my career in technology, and perhaps the lens I bring in is that one of engineering, meaning we know that some of these debates are simply not solvable. You'll never have everyone agreeing around the world on a given taxonomy or ontology. What will win is whomever can line up all the appropriate definitions and the resources all the way down to teacher level to make it happen. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. So very quickly, we're involved with a number of initiatives around the world. The ones that I mentioned, of course, beyond South Africa are the OECD and a few others. And you can see the range of countries here. So the problem, of course, is even before COVID, we've been talking about the curriculum being too broad, right? And no matter what, we've always had this gap between what teachers did in the classroom in reality versus what jurisdictions said they should be doing in terms of coverage. Because the time constraints were always there and the expertise was not always there. You know, it gets tougher and tougher to find good teachers as the complexity goes on with the grade level. And so even before COVID, we really needed to pay attention and modernize the context of the curriculum. You know, we've been in a fast changing world for 3 decades now, so it's long overdue. And so the reason why it was described as irrelevant is meeting real world needs. And here, of course, I don't mean any disrespect to academics. I've become one of us. But I'm also saying that we have to have a different lens, and some academics are more traditional and some are more progressive. And I think we here have a number of progressive ones. The problem, of course, is that there were a number of old subjects and topics that were still being covered, no matter what, in traditional disciplines. Why so much trigonometry? Why so little statistics and probabilities? Why so much of the traditional disciplines? Why no time for engineering or entrepreneurship or technology? So we needed to modernize the curriculum even before COVID. COVID made it even worse. The time constraints on the teacher have become a lot worse, and the expertise to teach online simply was not built. And so things have gotten even worse by a long shot. And on the relevance side, of course, as Sarah was saying, we need to teach these things as part of an education. They're not just a layer that you throw on top and hope it happens. Of course, you can teach critical thinking in all grades, in all disciplines. For instance, you want to teach the political courage to undertake some of the needed changes. And then we also have to pay attention to what Sarah called literacies, which I relate very closely to Perkins' work, which what we call themes, interdisciplinary themes in the knowledge section of our framework. And we relate them to the SDG themes because it's a question of purpose, not just, you know, goodness of thing. So information literacy, scientific literacy, etc., are taught as part of the disciplines. And then, as I said, why not teach modern disciplines? Well, because we run out of time, because the old ones have sucked up all the time and space. So when I wrote 21st Century Skills back in 2008, it was nice and gratifying to see it picked up around the world, where pretty much everyone talks about 21st century skills, and roughly speaking, everyone understands that it means the 4 C's you see here. But that's not enough, because as you know, there's more to life than just knowing how to apply your knowledge. You also have to pay attention to character and meta-learning. So we came up with this book, and we quickly found out, this is an unreleased piece of research we're doing with Brookings, it will be released in October, that even the Finlands of the world stop in their description at the progression level. They don't have pedagogical frameworks and approaches, they don't have assessments. And so that is, of course, a problem. If you're trying to adopt deep teaching of these competencies, you'd better go beyond simply overall recommendations. You need to have the system all the way through applying them properly. Now, if you have a framework like ours, then you can easily map to just about any country. You can crosswalk to Finland, you can crosswalk to Brazil, you can crosswalk to corporations like Microsoft. It becomes a Rosetta Stone. So I understand the complexity of coming up with a unified framework around the world. That's never going to happen. In engineering, we have, of course, committees like IEEE and so on that come up with standards and protocols. Otherwise, we couldn't even have this conversation. That's not going to happen in education. The language is imprecise, it's not like engineering. And so the best chance we have is to have a Rosetta Stone that can cover all sorts of frameworks and then do crosswalks as needed on a country basis. And I also rejoin here Sarah in talking about transfer. Yes, and education is about expertise and transfer. And I absolutely love the work that David here at Harvard has done. Excuse me. But that means, as I was saying earlier, modernizing the context of what we cover, paying attention to what's essential in terms of content, paying attention to core concepts. So when Sarah says we need to teach scientific literacy, she's right. It's just not taught because we spend all our time on the minutiae. You know, we're really at the bark of the tree rather than explaining the forest itself. And so concepts get lost, they don't get taught. Things like proof in mathematics or scientific method or whatever don't get taught enough. And so people are completely puzzled by misinformation. Should I believe it or should I not? They don't even have the mental models about how to think about misinformation. Then, of course, as described, competencies and assessments and pedagogy, all of which need to come together. Now, by now, I hope you have internalized that it's really a matrix between competencies and knowledge. You don't teach critical thinking out of thin air. It has to be supported by something. They're taught through knowledge. Now, if you were to ask teachers, do you teach XYZ competency? Most teachers will say, yeah, I do. Of course, I teach communication. Of course, I teach this. But the challenge is not whether they teach some of the things some of the time. The challenge is whether they teach it deliberately, comprehensively, systematically, and demonstrably. And when you start asking these tough questions, no one can stand up and say, yeah, I do all these things all the time properly, etc. And how could they? It takes an enormous amount of time to do this preparation. Someone's got to do it for the teachers. That's part of our role. That's part of the Department of Education's role. So let me walk you now quickly through an example to show how all these things can come together. The real worldness, but also all these competencies, how you can teach all of these things as you're deploying a single lesson. Turns out that 4 years ago at an OECD meeting in China, we were presenting this example about Zika. Now, how much foresight is that? Now we'll be presenting it about COVID. But the point is, people do not understand exponentials because they don't understand what I'm going to be describing here. They don't have the creativity to figure out, well, how do we devise different solutions? You know, does the speed of fielding doctors have any impact? Well, you're in South Africa, so you certainly have heard a lot more perhaps than in the rest of the world about the Ebola crises that reoccur in Western Africa. And so, well, what do you do about this? Do you field more doctors? Do you field more nurses? What exactly do you do? How do you reason about the mathematics of exponentials? That's critical thinking. Then how do you communicate and collaborate, right? All these things can be just part of a project on exponentials, which is exactly the sort of thing we are developing to help train teachers. Then, well, how do you teach character in that context? Well, if you have why wouldn't you bring the aspect of interconnectedness of humanity, even if it's for selfish purposes, never mind altruistic purposes? By plane, the disease is anywhere in the world in 24 hours. So there's no escaping being, in essence, having solidarity with each other. And what about curiosity? Are there other things that are exponential in life? Global warming, perhaps. Shouldn't that worry us? And courage. We have people who sacrifice their life. Wouldn't that be worth a mention as we talk about exponentials? How about resilience? If you're an expectant mother and you had Zika, you have a microcephalic kid. The ethics of prevention. Is it fair not to have enough preparedness in a country? Is it fair to not have enough beds available for the most disadvantaged of us? Particularly in wealthy countries that have top-notch systems at the top and then abysmal systems at the bottom. And I'm speaking of the United States here. And then leadership. Response time matters. And we saw the complete breakdown in leadership in
thank you, Ro.
Excuse me?
I don't think it is ours. It's not ours.
Okay. Lastly, meta-learning. You would want to teach a growth mindset because the student can learn how to sophisticate the model little by little. We've seen plenty of models now about COVID, and we can use them in our own education now about exponentials, saying, hey, this is a very simple model, and this is one step at a time. How do we make it more complex? And eventually we get to metacognition. Example, in this case, models are useful, but they're not accurate. There's no such thing as a perfectly accurate model. It's like weather forecasting, but it's useful, okay? So that's the sort of reflection that comes out of this sort of deeply prepared project that brings in all these competencies and deep knowledge simultaneously. So to wrap up, COVID is forcing the jurisdictions to do the cleanup work that they should have been doing for decades now. Short term, what is absolutely essential for COVID? What is the absolute must-have? Right now, it's really the Band-Aid or the tourniquet, if you want. But medium term, we have to have the courage, the political courage, to start a deep redesign of these curricula. And very often you see in times of crisis, people focus on the short term. And then when the crisis lets off a bit, everything goes back to normal. We will not have more normals. This is becoming more and more of a volatile world. We need to start the deep redesign now. We have, as a center, 8 years ago, and we're hoping to have others benefit. We've been working on a deep redesign of mathematics with ACARA in Australia and with the OECD. And this needs to be done for all disciplines so that there is time and space to teach modern aspects of a given discipline, competencies, of course, and much deeper attention to transfer via projects, which again needs to be put in place. All of this wrapped into exquisite professional development for teachers. Otherwise, we'll never get there. And with that, I'm 6 minutes and 30 seconds early on my presentation, which gives us time to rebound and ask questions.
Thank you very much, Charles. I love the concept of a deeper curriculum, and I probably would want to hear more about that. But let me give opportunity for a few people to respond, and then we'll have the questions for you afterwards. And the first, there are 3 respondents. They each have 10 minutes. So the first one is Mr. Siliki Tlabani, who is the Chief Director for Math, Science and Technology, as well as ICT in the Department of Basic Education. I first met him when he was in the NGO sector, and more than 30 years ago, he was involved in Protec as the CEO, and later also in another NGO that deals with e-learning equipment. But I just want to say in brevity, he has led, he's not only accountable for the rollout of ICT in basic education, but he has led the process of developing the coding and robotics curriculum framework for grades R through 9. And that has taken him to many countries, Cuba, South Korea, China, Japan, and France. We're looking forward to hearing your response, Mr. Tlabani. Over to you. You 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Prof. I hope you can see my presentation and you can also hear me well.
Yeah, we can see it. Your connectivity seems to be a bit unstable, but let's see how it goes. We will see your presentation.
Hello, Prof.
Yeah.
Can you hear me well?
Carry on.
Prof, and right away.
Mr. Tlabane, we have got very poor sound quality from your mic. I'm going to suggest, can I just double check, Prof. Volmink, are you experiencing the same?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
So why don't we try the next
agreed.
respondent, and then we come back to Mr. Tlabane. Maybe there's time to fix his Wi-Fi connection.
Thank you.
Hello, Prof. Can you hear me?
So this is better. Yes, better now. Please go ahead then. We can hear you. Okay, let's fix that, and let's move on to Professor Anil Kanji now, and we'll come back to Mr. Tlabane. Anil Kanji is a research professor and coordinator of the postgraduate and research program in the Department of Education at the Tshwane University of Technology. We all know that he's very much involved in assessment for learning, and he's involved in a project like that. That's his niche area. He also serves as a research fellow at the Oxford University Centre for Educational Assessment, as well as at the Centre for International Teacher Education at CPUT. He was an executive director at the Human Sciences Research Council and headed the Centre for Education Quality Improvement there. So Anil is an advisor to many, UNICEF, UNESCO, Umalusi, and to JET. And it's a pleasure to invite Professor Kanji to respond to the presentations. Thank you.
Afternoon, everybody. I thought it was Harun's turn on now. I just saw his slides. So I'm not sure if we're going to be changing the order.
Sorry, Harun is actually meant to present first before Prof. Kanji.
Okay. Okay, fine. Then let me introduce Harun Mohammed. So you will get his slides up. Harun, we all know, is the Chief Director for Curriculum Development and Teacher Development at the Western Cape Education Department. And but before that, he was at Gauteng Education Department, and where he was the Executive Director for Teacher Development. He served on the Ministerial Review team for Curriculum 2005 with Linda Chisholm. I was also part of that group. And he started at primary school, and then he went and lectured at teacher training colleges, but also worked in the NGO sector. Harun, I hope we have the right person now. So you're the last person standing. So can I invite you to respond? Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I'm just waiting for the slides to come up. Thank you very much. So next slide, please. There we go. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity. The presentation is a series of reflections. I did participate in the previous seminar in this series, and then, obviously we're participating in all of the national discussions. And so basically my response is woven around, the Chinese saying that inner crisis are also moments for change. And so I'm just going to share a couple of reflections around those. If you could, okay, next slide, please. Please continue. Yeah, maybe if you can just drop down all of the points. Okay, so as Shirley was indicating in the introduction and the other speakers before me, COVID-19 has presented us with a number of challenges in all aspects of our lives and also across the globe. In particular, inequalities have deepened in all respects. And so just on the jobs front, for example, in South Africa, since March, 3 million people have lost their jobs. And the sources that I'm privy to are indicating that there are 10 million people with no steady income. The impact of that on education, as has been indicated, is that more than 65% of our learners have had very little school learning since March. In the case of families where jobs or businesses have been lost, there are financial challenges to continue with teaching and learning, and there's been a whole range of psychosocial issues that have arisen. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does this tell us in terms of what has been coming through, particularly in the last 5 months? There are, for me, a number of themes that have been coming through. So, food and food shortages are very high on the agenda. Some of the information sources are saying that we're going to be, we're already in a crisis and that crisis could deepen. I think what COVID is telling us is that it offers the opportunity to the curriculum for greater coverage. And I like the point that Charles was making about weighting the curriculum on more relevant issues. So health and safety, COVID being the one issue, but a lot of the other medical researchers are telling us that equally troubling is TB and HIV. Then communication and calculation skills. In South Africa, we've had a particular manifestation of an increase in gender-based violence. You would continue, please. Entrepreneurship as a result of the number of job losses, environmental care, and the question of inclusivity. So yeah, if you can just continue to the next slide. Okay, so what key points has this raised for us? So Charles in his presentation raised the issue that worldwide, evidence is clear that curriculum implementation is mile wide and inch deep. In South Africa, that's also the case. And in my view, CAPS can be regarded as a theme-sufficient curriculum. In other words, all of the issues that I raised before, are relevant to our lives, and the coverage of them in the curriculum is sufficient. In other words, there are topics and points in the curriculum where teachers can teach those. But as Sarah pointed out in her presentation, there's a lot of observers are saying there's information overload, and the proportional distribution of attention to the different areas is not as smooth as it needs to be. And then Pam Christie, in her lecture presented at the Nelson Mandela inaugural lecture, made an interesting point about CAPS's knowledge incomplete, and I will come to that point in a little while once we go further. You can just continue, please. Okay, so what do I mean by theme sufficient? If you take the issues that have arisen in the last 5 months, but I just want to point out that those issues are relevant whether we had COVID or not. All of those issues appear in some form or the other in CAPS at the moment. But the argument I want to put forward is that given that they are staring us so starkly in the face, and even in a projected post-COVID period, these issues will remain with us, that we should give consideration to reducing the scope in terms of the breadth of the themes, and perhaps make selections within the current CAPS framework to deepen the weighting of attention on these issues, is the general argument that I want to make. Please go ahead. Okay, so I've made the point about there's a tendency for CAPS to be information overloaded and skewed. And then the balance between what the curriculum researchers call powerful knowledge, everyday knowledge, and diversity requires a lot of attention in the CAPS curriculum. So for example, in the presentation that was done by Pam Christie yesterday, she points out that CAPS is at the moment Western-centric, and it does not pay sufficient attention to the issue of inclusion of knowledges from indigenous knowledge systems. Now, that debate has been in circulation for a long while, but as a country, we have not given it sufficient institutionalization. And perhaps this is the moment where, as we re-looking at how curriculum is going to be implemented, an opportunity is provided for getting that balance, the balance between the formal and the knowledge of power in relation to everyday knowledge, and also the diversity of knowledge traditions that we have. Please continue. And then Charles also makes the point that there's a significant gap between jurisdictions' intended curriculum versus teachers' implemented curriculum. And in South Africa, because of the long rote learning tradition that we've had, our opportunities to make an impact on the skills inequality and skills uncertainty that Professor Gravett mentioned are quite low. So we need to factor that into whatever work we'll be doing going forward. Please continue. Okay, so what is to be done? So we've got three, triple challenges of the question of knowledge, the question of making whatever is being presented as meaningful teaching and learning experiences to our learners to become more skills responsive. In other words, the turning of the acquisition of knowledge into capabilities, and the issue of character as the three challenges that we have. Please proceed. Okay, so in a well and equitably resourced system with a strong educator core, we could consider leapfrogging in the way that the Brookings report suggests. Please continue. Okay, and we could do that by changing subject structures and choices, such as has been done in the Finnish system, in Singapore, and Kenya has reputedly also adopted a competence-based system. But the challenge that we've, okay, and then the other challenge that I think Charles's presentation presents to us is, there's a very nice description in the CCR report on traditional subjects and modern subjects. If we look at CAPS at the moment, it falls into the traditional. And so although as a system we've been talking a lot about launching ourselves into the 21st century and becoming more responsive, our curriculum is not resembling that statement of intent. So the signals that are coming through, given where the South African system is, the capacity of the system, teacher resources, budget constraints, mindsets, and so on, is that currently what may be the best thing to do is the infusion of a skills and competences approach in the current CAPS as a short-term approach, and simultaneously then begin the process of the deeper, longer-term changes that Charles was suggesting. And this could be accompanied by pilots that test innovative teaching and learning programs. You could continue, please. Okay, and then incrementally we can make choices of modern subjects over traditional ones. Please proceed. Okay, and then also the more diverse knowledge selections could be, we could be at the right moment where those discussions could be taking place. If you could move further, please. Okay, so what would this infusion consist of? We've been having a lot of discussions in our province with our subject advisors and so on. And so the challenge we've been putting forward to people is, how can in and through the current CAPS processes, because we're mindful that to change a curriculum is not an easy process, and the country has had difficulties in the past with the number of changes that we've introduced. So
2 minutes left.
okay, within the current CAPS framework, how can we prioritize teaching and learning experiences in such a way that reading and calculation learning opportunities are prioritized in every subject? We could please move on. Okay, and then within the CAPS subjects, it is not impossible for us to take the themes that I mentioned earlier on and give them higher prioritization and weighting. Please proceed. And the same applies to assessment. And then to include in the CAPS documents or learning programs that will follow in this period more direction on appropriate pedagogies. And given the information that we've got, it looks like there will be a greater need for a focus on at-home and self-directed learning. And so our documents should contain more of that kind of guidance. Please proceed. Okay, and then we could consider pilots that test innovative and teaching and learning programs. Could please proceed. You could maybe bring all the... Okay, so we could increase school to entrepreneurship, employability, and education. There's already a well-developed plan. It could be presented in extracurricular form if necessary. And then I just want to end off with an example from the Brookings leapfrogging report, in which they quote a project in India where children are enrolled in the local schools, but through work with an NGO, outside school in the late afternoons, children are complementing their school-based learning by acquiring a wide range of skills through combination of play, peer learning technology, and light touch parental oversight involving offline tablet computers. Obviously, the detail of that I can't go into now. And on that note, those are just my sense of the reflections on what we could be possibly doing. The main point being that if we leave the curriculum as it stands, we may be missing an opportunity to introduce changes that can give us better outcomes than we've had so far. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Arun. Thanks for those thoughts. Anil, I think we are ready for you now. I've already introduced you.
Thank you, Chair. Greatly appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you again for the NECT. Perhaps I should start off with a tiny confession. When I agreed to do this, while the slides are coming up, when I agreed to do this seminar, I knew it's going to be a lot of work and I had to do a lot of reading and whatever. What I didn't understand and what I didn't expect is that it's going to lead to a tiny set of traumas for me. And the biggest trauma that I faced was, one, finding a shirt to wear for the seminar. And two, finding something that actually fits. But I'm so glad that I can now switch my video off as well. Colleagues, a brief for my, can you go to the next slide, please? So this is the brief that I was asked to look at. And the focus and highlighting on some of the implications for assessment in the fast changing world. And so next slide, please. And so let me start off by making about 3 main points. And the first is that just highlight some of the key issues that were noted by the keynote, which was basically the need to focus on broader sets of competence and skills that go beyond just the cognitive domain. And I particularly thought Sarah's presentation of teaching for meaningful learning and the manner of converting life worthiness to life readiness was quite important. And similarly, Charles' 4D framework, in particular, highlighting issues of mindfulness and curiosity and courage and resilience. And by the way, things that we also do a lot with our kids from low SES areas and using football as a means for doing this. Next slide, please. I suppose, given that input, the irony then of our response to the COVID-19 in a sense, has been what you could say, a very narrow focus on curriculum coverage and completion, And notwithstanding that this could be understood with a basic emphasis on the loss of learning and how best do we introduce catch-up programs, how best do we catch up and ameliorate this loss of learning. When we all know that learning is more than just cognitive domain, that it also extends to the psychosocial skills and emotional learning, which ironically in this time of COVID would be much more critical and much more important in the battle against the pandemic. Let me just say, I'm not arguing against the issue of loss of learning. Next slide, please. So what's missing? Actually, it shouldn't be missing. What's silent? I think the more appropriate, what's the silences in that our response? And I think the one key silence in the response is the pedagogy. It's the teachers and more important, the teaching. And rightfully so, the response is primarily focused on learners, parents, and the focus is on safety and health. But in that intervention, there has been limited emphasis and limited support on the myriad of pedagogical challenges of teachers. And Say It in Sing in that latest article and Say It really go quite deep into this. And I think that's a really important point that we've looked at. And more important, we don't really know what is taking place in the classrooms and the innovations of teaching and the teachers are ways and means they're trying to address it. And I'll give an example. But what we do know, and from the work that we've been doing with our group of local teachers here, is one of the biggest challenges, teachers, principals, subject advisors, provincial officials, even national officials, is the issue of assessment on a whole range of issues, and time doesn't permit to do that. And again, ironically, these challenges are also being faced by, in the UK. Last night I had a call with Joanne Bird, who's the head of department in Oxford, and she advises the UK ministry. And you all know the debacle that happened there where they cancel their exams and they use an algorithm by which to literally give matriculation grades. And certainly, even in the case of India, the cancellation of exams and the impact of COVID, which allows for all these holy grails, holy cows to be actually questioned and revised. But let me give you an example from one of the schools I contacted of both innovation and limitation in terms of pedagogy. This school is a Q1 school, and I found their approach really innovative in that they teach on alternative days, Monday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, and they leave Fridays open. And this was really good for those learners and or classes that need more assistance. And very few schools take this model. However, the limitation in the innovation is that they then rely on tests to identify which learners need support. In the context of teachers that have very little technical skills of developing good quality tests that identifies learner needs and learner gaps.
5 minutes.
Go on, please. Thank you. Next slide. So let me, I think the point that Sarah raised on nomenclature is really important. And I want to focus on how this manifests in the assessment system and the practices and policies. Next slide, please. So let me then, I won't talk, Harun talk a lot about some of the context issues on teachers, etc. The one key point is that the issue of assessment has been a perennial problem since the 90s. And it has been raised in the NEPI days, it has been raised in the commissions that both John and Linda Chisholm has been involved, etc. And one of the key challenges is there's different terms and concepts used, misinterpretation, misalignment, etc. And the second key issue pertaining to assessment is the emphasis of the ministries and or education department on this performative regimes that foreground accountability over support. And at the policy level, this manifests as a really interesting, valid policies which are assessment focused, but measurement driven. Just go next slide, please. So again, let me give an example. And if you look at this On the left is basically an assessment system that foregrounds performance. And if you look at it, the classrooms is really classroom assessments where most teaching and learning, where the key teaching and learning occurs is last. And I'm arguing for a system that's on the right-hand side where it foregrounds learning. And key difference is learning, and where classroom assessments are important, and the missing component is that adequate school support. Can we move on? So the issue of performance and learning is really important. It has also equity implications, but I really don't have time to go into that. So let's just move on to the next slide. Thank you. So let me give a clear understanding of one of the biggest problems is what do people understand the purpose of assessment and and in general in assessment for learning in particular. We argue clearly the purpose of assessment is to get evidence of learning and or performance. But the biggest challenge is summative assessment, formative assessment. And so I want to give this example where summative assessment is simply measuring plants. It doesn't impact growth. Formative assessment where you feed and water the plants appropriate to the needs, which impacts on growth. And the third dimension, which a lot of people confuse, is the formative use of summative results, is where you return after measuring to feed and water plants. And so the second and third are the two dimensions together, which is actually the assessment for learning approach. And I believe if we get this right, it's going to address a whole lot of confusion and challenges. Can we move to the next slide, please? So,
2 minutes.
Thank you. So what are the practical implications? Let me say one of the practical implications is that if you look at circulars 2 or 3 is to reduce the number of assessments, call for greater formative assessments. And in the initial drafts, we saw that looking at formative assessment as a technical exercise and as a technical understanding on how to use it rather than looking at learning, but on performance. But more important, it overlooks the reality. And there's equally poor assessment capability of teachers across all quintile categories. Next slide, please. So what I'm saying is what the pandemic has exposed is a limited capacity in terms of our understanding and interpretations. But I'm also arguing, given my engagements with teachers, principals, there's a recognition of this limitation within the policymaking fraternity, as evidenced by the calls for support and assistance and the involvement of a broader range of people involved, and as well as expose serious misalignments and contradictions between the assessment and curriculum policies and the negative impacts on. Next slide. And the next slide, I'm showing a pic of a system we've been trying to work on, of an assessment system where you see learning is in the middle, the triangle is in the classroom, that involves the key components of classroom as well as exams. And outside is both the national assessment, international, and school evaluation that is intricately linked and within the frameworks of the curriculum, the policies, the structures, and the systems. And we'll go on to the next slide, please. Sorry, I didn't have time to explain that even further. So let me just, moving forward then, argue and make a note that it's education and curriculum reform within a fast-changing world also requires reform within the ranks of policymakers and the policymaking processes, which should be more inclusive, transparent, and democracy. And that begins with the reality that government needs help, but more important, the ability, and as I have seen, that the need to work together to bring about teaching, as what Sarkis noticed, the teaching for meaningful learning. The second critical point is the need for greater voice and participation of teachers, which to a large extent has been very, very minimal in this whole response to the COVID. And maybe to end off with a positive note before I'm giving one last exercise, that in my engagements, I found that the COVID has brought out greater levels of positivity and energy levels of openness, teachers, principals, subject advisors, and policymakers, which I think holds great promise for real and much needed positive change in the system. Last slide, please. And in the spirit of a formative assessment approach to give you that practical experience while you're waiting for the next speaker, can you now list 2 new things you learned from this presentation? In fact, all the presentations if you want to, not only mine. And secondly, list 1 thing that you would do differently in your practice for yourself and that you should do now as a formative assessment practice that teachers usually engage in for enhancing learning. And let me then, next slide, say thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Professor Kanji. Very interesting presentation. We now have to move on to the last respondent, Mr. Tlabani, who was going to be the first one. I believe he has been able to fix the problems that he had with connectivity. And so, Mr. Tlabani, I invite you to do your response.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you to fellow panelists. And it is a great honor for DBE to be invited to this webinar on this very relevant subject. Let me also hasten to submit apology from DDG, Deputy Director General, Dr. Mamiki Maboya, who had graciously agreed to come and share the platform with the presenters. But as a result of many things that she is responsible for, she was unable to come, and it's an honor for me to represent the Department of Basic Education. I will try to go through this in the next 10 minutes, and this is the DBE's response to the topic, the subject itself. Let me do a slide presentation. And I have packaged it in a manner that would give you a sense that the Department of Basic Education, since 2017, 2018, we've been seeking to respond to a number of questions with regard to the skills for the changing world and what type of skills and competencies, knowledge, attitudes learners will be required to possess once they exit their schooling days. And research points to the fact that, for example, the Oxford University points to the fact that 45% of the current jobs as we know them today, they will not exist in about 5 to 10 years' time. In fact, their assessment is a little bit moderate because there are those who actually predict up to 60% of the current jobs will not exist. Now, the responsibility of any education system is to prepare its learners for this future, for these future jobs, for 2 purposes. 1, to occupy those jobs that will be created, and secondly, to be creators of these jobs themselves. And that it's important for them to possess the skills. And the presentation has been crafted in such a way that there is a question that I share with the webinar that we asked ourselves this question and we put plans. And I will not speak to the progress much, but I will be speaking to the plans just to share with you the thinking within the basic education sector. The first question, key, that we had to respond to as basic education is what are the core skills and competencies for the curriculum from birth up to grade 12 that our learners need to possess for them to be able to function effectively in the future. And we then responded by making a decision to adopt an adaptable competence and skills framework that will be responsive to the future needs of the country to ensure that we supply the country with learners who possess the necessary skills. And this then also hang on the need to develop a competence-based curriculum integrating the skills and competencies. And the speakers who came before me spoke about the importance of coming up with clear definitions and nomenclature around the skills and the competencies so that we know what we're actually talking about. And we say this must actually thread across subjects in line with the IBE framework that I will speak to later on. And it is not only about the skills and competencies threading through across various subjects, but when necessary that we introduce subjects that will be dedicated towards developing these competencies and the skills. Now, the second question is, how will then the three streams model give effect to these future skills and competencies? For members who have attended here who do not have the background to the three streams model, the three streams model is an approach through which basic education is emphasizing the importance of skills development, and that we move from the knowledge-based type of curriculum, but we also focus on developing skills. And our vision is to have at least about 40% of our learners following what you call the academic stream, and the other 60% following the other two streams, which is the technical vocational, that seeks to develop the vocational skills of learners, and the third stream, which is a technical occupational, that seeks to develop and equip learners with those occupational skills. Now, we said what we need to do is, the way schools are organized at the moment, there's a lot of duplication, and that there's a need for us to rationalize the curriculum offerings, that we should not have two schools that exist side by side, both of them offering commercial subject, that then we are depriving learners of other offerings that they could be receiving. That the issue of establishment of one technical high school that is offering technical subjects and also offering occupational programs within every one of over 500 circuits that we have in the country, and that we needed to map the focus schools in line with the industrial development zones. And the focus schools are these schools that are going to be dedicated towards promoting specific skills and competencies. This map just gives you a sense of where those special economic zones are in the country, and I assume that a whole lot of you are aware of this, that we need to set up and establish these schools to feed the economic drives within those zones. And how will the three streams model give effect to this? We said we identified 10 national schools of excellence, meaning the types of schools that must be established throughout the country. For instance, a school for aviation, a school for marine sciences, an agricultural school, a high-tech school, agricultural schools, and those type of schools that it's important that we need to establish these schools across all circuits in the country. And how will the three streams model then give effect to these future jobs continued? That we need to establish those type of schools, the maths and science schools, BCM schools, services, art schools, and we need to establish an agricultural focus school whose curriculum will respond to the global markets in agricultural technology. That it is not only about teaching children about gardening, but you must actually teach them about commercialization and how they can actually access the market so that they take interest in food security issues. And we have decided as the Department of Basic Education to adopt the International Bureau of Education competency framework. And we decided that this framework, we are going to come up with additional skill sets that are responsive to the demands for the 4IR, meaning preparing these learners for future job, and that integrates and develop entrepreneurship. There are speakers who spoke about the importance of entrepreneurship earlier on, and that the whole idea is to develop the entrepreneurship skills, and we have already adopted the framework on entrepreneurship that is infused into subjects, and we are currently driving that E-cubed strategy. We also have made a deliberate decision to introduce new subjects like coding and robotics and marine sciences and aviation, as I indicated earlier on. And these are the subjects that are preparing learners for the jobs of the future, to ensure that they will be able to function effectively in future, and that we will not be producing learners who will be unemployable and will be unable to produce jobs. Now, key to all this, in addition to the curriculum, it is an issue of teacher preparation, because curriculum is delivered through teachers. Now, our pre-service curriculum, that is the responsibility of universities, as well as continuous professional teacher development programs, must feed into this and be responsive to equipping teachers with the knowledge and the skills that they will be able to deliver these new subjects, and they'll be able to prepare learners effectively to occupy these future jobs. Now, the teachers, as they are right now, we believe that they need to be supported until they are able to exercise professional judgment, which we believe that COVID-19 has actually pushed us even faster towards the direction of giving teachers the responsibility of exercising their professional judgment. But it's important to capacitate them so that when they make their professional judgment, they do this in the wake of ensuring that what they do supports this vision by the Department of Education. Chair, we have started, even before COVID came in, with developing Teaching Mathematics for Understanding framework, which was an acknowledgement by the Department of Basic Education that our curriculum was wide and very thin in terms of its depth, and that we developed this framework where we discarded content that we thought was not core, and that we focus on core content and principles that develops skills that are needed, this time focusing on number sense, to ensure that children can operate, can practice the four operations and be able to apply their minds and demonstrate understanding of what they are doing, as opposed to just remembering procedures that they were taught. Now, when we were piloting this, COVID came upon us, and this drove us into further trimming of the curriculum and reorganization of the curriculum, and exercise that we completed working with our key partners, labor, all provinces, and academics, to ensure that we leave out those concepts and content that is not core, and that we sequence this content in such a way that only the content that will be the building blocks for the subsequent grades, learners are going to be taught that. We have done that, and this is one acknowledgement on the part of the basic education, in line with the inputs that were made earlier on by my fellow panelists, to ensure that we only teach that is core. And our teachers we have developed a number of frameworks and guidelines, and we are supporting teachers, preparing them to do further trimming and reorganization within their schools, where the annual teaching plans may be reduced further depending on the remaining time. So COVID has propelled us into a direction that we had already acknowledged was necessary. Chairperson, thank you very much for the time that you gave us as basic education, and we are excited to indicate that we had already started with this thinking, and that we're working and following the work that is done by the Center for Curriculum Redesign and other institutions in the world, like the Brookings Institute, that had actually evaluated a number of curricula, and they gave us a report that says CAPS in its current form already acknowledges those skills and competencies for the changing world. However, what we need to do is to ensure that we find creative ways of ensuring that we package the curriculum, we train teachers, and we also develop assessment protocols that would ensure that learners can learn using new approaches like play-based approaches, and that when we assess what is key, and our assessment changes from assessment of learning and moving to assessment for learning. That the former speaker, the previous speaker indicated that it's important that after doing your own authoring, that you come back, you assess, and then after learning from what you have assessed, then you actually go back and strengthen that you are doing. That assessment must support learning and not just to check what has been learned Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tlabani, for that interesting presentation in response to the two keynote speakers. We've now had 3 respondents. We are running a bit late. We are running 5 minutes behind schedule. So I wondered if I can ask the following. While the 2 keynote speakers are going to give a very brief response to what they've heard from the 3 respondents, I wondered if you could get ready, the audience. I know we are about 90, more than 90 people, but we can't, of course, deal with all the questions. But while Charles and Sarah are responding to the respondents, could I ask you to begin to put up your questions in the chat room? Or if you would like to, raise your hand and you can then put the question after the 2 keynote speakers have responded. Thank you. Sarah, do you want to go first, or Charles?
Happy to go first if you want, or Sarah?
I'll go first, please. Go.
Well, thank you. So John, first of all, I'll be stealing your bridge analogy with attribution. It's gorgeous. It's perfect for the times. Yeah. Look at the problems we're having here. We have bandwidth issues, right? Bandwidth is so much easier to build than roads. And the mindset is continue to build roads. That's an analogy of the sort of change that needs to occur. Roads are much more expensive than bandwidth to lay down, and yet politicians will privilege building roads. When we talk about leapfrogging, typically the example of Kenya comes to mind when it comes to cellular banking, and that's great. But it also implies that there's a mindset of significant change that can be put into action. And that's really hard to do. I'm going to be perhaps less tactful here, but departments of education around the world do not seem to accept that they need help from outsiders. And I don't mean just reading a book that I or others come up with. I don't mean just going and visiting other jurisdictions. You really need help to rethink those curricula. It's extremely complicated. Even the Finlands and the Singapores of the world need help at this point. And unfortunately, the higher the PISA results, the less willing these countries are to accept that perhaps even their staffs are incapable of doing the sort of complexity we're talking about. Because there's so much confusion in those staffs about what is content versus concept. And that's valid for a lot of academics in any discipline. There's so much confusion about how to embed these competencies, etc. Some of us have done a ton of work to move things forward. And I really beg all jurisdictions to accept the external help and not just think, thank you for the books, thank you for the papers, we'll do it ourselves. So I'm sorry if this sounds like a bit of what we call tough love, but this is a message I'm passing on more and more to jurisdictions, and some are more open than others to this external help. Let me give an example of coding as why that external help is needed. Everyone thinks that, oh, well, I taught my kids how to code. First of all, do you know that coding can be just as boring as math if it's not done right? And that you're going to have a 20% retention rate rather than a 66% retention rate as we have, because we bring in all sorts of other things than just coding. That's an example of where you could use help in thinking about what you actually consider modern curricula. When we talk about IBE as being a framework, as Sarah said, it's not a framework that's implementable all the way to the classroom level. So we are building a crosswalk, again, to show how you go from a theoretical framework of wishes and aspirations all the way to something can actually work in the classroom. And lastly, I'm going to say all of this needs to be done with a sense of urgency. You know, I'm sorry, but education departments are used to a 10-year cycle. This can no longer be the case. You know, we have to come up with things very fast. Obviously, you all are for COVID as a patch, as a Band-Aid. But medium term, and I don't mean 10 years, I mean 3 years, we have to come up with completely revised curriculum and start training teachers about how to implement it, not a decade. So the sense of urgency really, really matters. So these were my comments, and happy to answer more questions.
Thank you very much, Charles. Sarah?
Thank you very much. Let me first start by linking to some of the things that Charles said. You know, Charles, when people refer to coding, and we ourselves at the university are involved in coding projects, so I'm not at all making a case that coding could not be important. But the question that we need to ask with all these decisions that are taken in terms of the curriculum or changes in the curriculum, for what purpose? Are we absolutely clear what coding for what purpose? And are we then ensuring that, as you indicated, that it's not a subject that is actually in the end not going to add really any value as such? So important decisions to take there. Very briefly then, in response to some of our respondents, so Anil, in just to say, you reminded me to water my plants. I will go and do that immediately. What I particularly liked, and it was also mentioned by Mr. Tlabane, is the notion of placing learning central. And I don't think we are doing it sufficiently yet. If I listen to the discourse that teachers use, is I must cover the curriculum. And that becomes the important focus at the moment, and maybe because the curriculum is sometimes much too full. So the focus is on covering the curriculum and not what children are learning. And if we could develop, all of us involved, that mindset to place learning central, and to continue, when we look at also the curriculum, ask ourselves, what should children be learning for now and for the future, and why? And that should be a central consideration. And it brings me back to the notion of life, of a life-worthy curriculum. And again, just to say what was mentioned also by some of the colleagues, that curriculum is also as good as how we implement it. So a life-worthy curriculum does not mean that we will have life-ready learnings if we don't teach in a way that enables the life readiness. And the focus on assessment for learning, I couldn't agree more. You know, Derek Roundtree, who wrote widely wrote about assessment, and particularly in higher education, but what he said is applicable, I think, to all levels of education. He said, if you want to know the truth of an education system, look at its assessment practices, and that will tell you what is really valued within an education system. And that's something that was addressed also by Mr. Tlabane and by Anil. And maybe a last thing to say about assessment, and here I'm talking in higher education, but again, I think it is equally applicable in school education. What COVID-19 brought as a gift is we had to rethink our assessment practices radically in higher education in some cases. And colleagues who would have in the past not even have considered using certain types of assessment had to rethink their assessment practices, because we are sometimes using assessment practices based on tradition and not really ensuring that our assessment aligns with the purpose of what we are teaching and with the envisaged outcomes. Last point is about the renewals that we have in the curriculum. And yes, I agree with you, Charles, that there is a sense of urgency. But I also think there needs to be a sense of realism with regard to what is possible to do within time frames. So we've also learned, I think, from some of our difficulties in the past, that sometimes pushing something too quickly means that we then have to radically rethink halfway what we are doing, which has really led to instability in the education system, and that teachers also become quite despondent. Thank you.
Sarah, if I may quickly respond to you on this one last point. I completely agree. It's rushing, it's fast but not rushing. View it as an S-curve where we take the time to prepare, we implement rapidly the changes inside the curriculum, and then we take time to deploy. So yeah, it's really talking about that phase where we revamp the curriculum to be fast, whereas the preparation about what should it be for, what are the points, etc., that requires time, and then the deployment requires time. And it's not just this linear function.
Yes, yeah, that I agree with fully. You know, I also like the term hurry slowly. Yeah. And I do think that summarizes also what you said. Thank you, Charles.
Hurry in the right places and be slow in the right places.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah and Charles. I am going to open it up for about 10 minutes for questions. There are some people that the first one is Dr. Rene Somneth of SATU. He wants to ask a question, and I'm allowed to do that, Rene. And then, of course, there are some, John Gilmore has put up a question, and I'm just going to ask Shirley and Kathy if they can just assist with the written questions.
Can I go ahead? Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity and for the presentations. My biggest concern is that I don't think there's sufficient acknowledgement that we have looked deeply into how the world is organized currently in terms of politics, economic, technology, globalization, environment, and so on, for us to make a determined effort to try to link the discourses about how to make those better, and to bring those and link them to the subject content that we've got. Because there seems to be a myopic view that technology is going to be the solver of all problems, but we haven't given attention to politics, economics in terms of the way the world is organized. So my question, shouldn't we engage in an exercise that says, this is how the world is organized. What subject content do we need so that we can create the mental experiences for learners to fit in there? Regarding technology, I think there's something there that says that we need to look in there because that is what's going to advance the world. It's a small component of the bigger purpose of education. And also the AI and the fourth industrial revolution, I think those are big distractors because artificial intelligence is man-made intelligence, which is excellent for particular competencies, but not for the complexity of engaging with human development and human mind progress. It is not there yet. So I just want to leave it there and ask the question, do we need to look further into how the world is organized and how schooling can serve that purpose and what subjects and content that we need? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me take 3 questions at a time.
That's already 3 questions.
Yeah, that's true, but we'll take the latter part of that. So can we, and the question is how the world can be, how can we organize the curriculum around the changing world? I think that is...
Could I please answer? I mean, some of us have done this work for years. If the person asking the question is not aware of it, we'll be happy to share that information. The point is not to constantly revisit and constantly ask the same question. One question I would love to ban in education circles is, how can we? Because it doesn't propose a solution. A lot of people have already analyzed the how can we and are proposing solutions. I think everybody should just look at what's out there and say, okay, this worked well for, let's say, World Economic Forum, high technology countries. How do we localize it to our own? That is necessary. And for that, you can easily bring in the chambers of commerces or whatever that you have in your country and make that more explicit linkage. In other words, you may need more agronomy engineers than you need biotech engineers, perhaps. Make those determinations. So, but overall, whether we need different types of math, etc., that has already been determined in many, many ways in many places and reports. So it's really a question of moving beyond that and applying.
Thank you. You want to add to that, Sarah?
Yes, I wanted to agree with Charles fully. You know, a lot of work has been done by the OECD, by the World Economic Forum, and by many others, and by Charles and his own center. So lots of this thinking has been done. We are probably not aware of that. But I want to add a caveat that I read the other day, which I fully agreed with. If COVID-19 has taught us one thing, it is that the world is unpredictable. So it is also not possible to be absolutely sure what would people need or our children need in 10 years' time. Even last year, none of us would have been able to make the prediction of what we need now. But we know enough that the core disciplines remain important, without a doubt. And as Charles referred to earlier, also the modern disciplines, and all of this work has indeed been done. It just needs to be contextualized maybe and localized for South Africa.
Thank you very much. I see there's a question by AJ Fontaine asking about whether we are preparing individuals for the job market, or are we looking at developing critical thinkers able to apprehend and function in society?
Both. It's a very, very old debate that is way past its time. We've gone through this for decades now. The characteristics that make a good citizen are the same characteristics that make a good employee. Would you like your citizen to be ethical, but then your employee not? Would you like your employee to be courageous, but your citizen not? These are moot debates. What we're talking about is good for everybody. And if we can do the most, meaning good for society and themselves, they will automatically be good for business. So it's not really about doing something specific for business. This is not about, I'm teaching you how to weld so that it can be used by, so it can be employed by XYZ company. It's about how do we make you able to think so it can be useful to yourself, to society, and to employers, okay? I think we're way past these old debates, and without being particularly pro-hyper capitalism or at all or anything. It's just a question of being fair to humanity and develop the entire Maslow pyramid for every individual and society.
I could add, I agree fully with Charles, but the point that we've made also quite a few times, it's not about doing one or the other. It's about preparing children for life, which means while you are teaching them a specific subject area, through the way that you teach, you are teaching them also critical thinking. Through the way that you teach, you are teaching them communication, etc. So it is not the one or the other. And it's also not a case of saying to children, now I'm teaching you critical thinking.
Exactly.
It might be good sometimes to name what you are teaching them, but it's the way of the pedagogy that you use will help them to become critical thinkers, or to become good communicators, or to be able to really reflect on their own thought processes in relation to metacognition.
Precisely, Sarah. And the example that I've used from Zika, Ebola, COVID for exponentials, that's a perfect example of transfer that works everywhere. Meaning, if you only come out of math thinking f of x equals e at the x power, that's inert. If you apply it to diseases and global warming, etc., now is it useful for yourself? Yes. Is it useful for society? Yes. Is it useful for business? Yes. And you haven't done anything particularly good or particularly bad about it, right? It's just the way it's taught, as you said.
Confirming, we have a question, or someone who would like to ask a question, Ruan Marman.
Yes, I see that. And John Gilmore, do you want to ask your question verbally? Because I
I'd
see
be very
you put
happy
up a
to do
question.
that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
let me take Rowan.
Okay.
Yeah, and then you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and good afternoon, everybody. I think this conversation revolves around a lot more than what happens with the curriculum inside our classrooms. I think in South Africa, we are faced long before the pandemic with a huge issue, and that is poverty. The poverty stats of our citizens are off the charts. Now, my view is that unless we attend to the schooling experience as a whole properly, to fit our society and our particular conditions, and how the South African economy has been set up to privilege a few, we are not going to make any ground here. We are not going to make the ground in the classrooms with the curriculum. When we tinker with it, we can tinker with it, that's fine. But our approach should not be that the tinkering of a curriculum because of this urgency now is going to attend to the poverty, because at the end of the day, that a social justice imperative is very important. I like the ideas of the life worthiness and the life readiness. And I think if we can centralize that in our conversation going forward, it can become that educational justice conversation that it is supposed to be. My view is, however, that what we've seen during the pandemic in South Africa, and our government has responded to it, is that the education ministry doesn't have a proper grip on what plays out, particularly in our school communities, whether it's classrooms, whether it is with teachers, and whether it's with school communities as a whole. So I'm thinking we are missing the nexus. We are missing praxis in terms of how we approach the educational discourse. For many years, for 25 years now in our democracy, we have responded, we have been reactive. We have been reactive. We are being reactive now again, but we are forced to, so that's fine. But I'm thinking there's a lack of praxis in our educational conversation as a whole. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks, Charles. It seems that you want to respond to that directly.
Yeah, Ruan, I totally agree with you. Inequities are an enormous problem, even in the US. Look at how poorly we're doing here, with these inequities. So you're right that we're trying to solve poverty issues through education. That's a long-term solve. But even to get there, think of Singapore and Korea, South Korea. They have zero natural resources, right? South Korea, after the Korean War, had the GDP per capita of Afghanistan. Look at where it is now. These countries devoted 25% of their GDP to education. They really worked hard for several generations to get there. Unfortunately, countries that have a wealth of natural resources tend to fall behind because they feel that they can count on those natural resources. Whereas if you're a small island like Singapore, you absolutely have nothing except swamp. You cannot sell swamp. So that's why a lot of countries have been forced to be pushing themselves forward. Finland was the poorest country in Europe after World War II, etc. So it's perfectly possible to make that transformation if you really reallocate the resources in a country. And I'm fully with you on that. This is the profound issue of equity and reallocation of resources and wealth. And we're seeing this increasing the world over in its intensity, and COVID is only aggravating that was already a bad situation.
Thank you. John, do you want to ask your question now?
Yes, please. Firstly, I'd like to say, Charles, your urgency and your clarity is inspiring, and I'm very grateful to have heard you face to face, having read a lot of your work. I want to just call out an elephant in the room, though, from a South African point of view, that I would love to hear from you how you think you can trigger change in a teacher corps that is dysfunctional and disillusioned. And I'm going to generalize here, and I will be at some risk of doing this. But essentially, our teachers are not reading, not engaged, and are in fact sitting passively in the process of this discussion. And schools are dull places where generally expectations of teachers of themselves and expectations of teachers of student performance are low. And we could use, if we take a Paulo Freire view, we could use the idea of the internalized oppressor and the internalized oppression, the disabling elements in the teacher corps specifically. My experience working in impoverished communities is that children can make that transition very quickly and will make that transition and would respond so well to the new structures and the new ideas that you represent. But what have you applied thinking to how one triggers that? How do you shift? There've got to be some levers and triggers that will send electricity into the system and activate teachers in a way that they've never been activated or have not been activated for maybe a decade or two. Thank you.
Thank you. Any response? Yes.
I could respond. I could respond, but I don't want to monopolize the time. Sarah, if you have a response.
I'll give Sarah a time to answer this. Oh, yeah, John.
I think Charles, John particularly asked you to respond. I could add.
Okay, happy to do so. So John, thanks for the kind words. Look, any demoralized organization goes through the same. I mean, you can look at corporations that have had bad results for decades and decades. They're terribly demoralized, right? You bring in new leadership with fresh ideas, with the dynamizing vision, and things turn around. Now, I don't know to what extent you have difficulties with unions blocking change or whatever, but unions too can be part of change. Saying, look, we are gonna socially enhance the status of all your members. That is absolutely critical for us. It's the most important profession we have in the country. We're gonna put our money where our mouth is. We're gonna hyper train them. We're gonna give them this exoskeleton, you know, to be able to carry heavier loads. We're gonna do all this training for them. It requires leadership, it requires funding, it requires a vision. All these things are possible. You have to just find the right leader willing to put their courage on the line.
Thanks, Sarah.
There are no easy answers here, but the one thing that I do want to emphasize is the responsibility also that higher education institutions have now to ensure that the student teachers that we send into the field are well prepared. We are not always able to address a long history in education with teachers who've been in education for many years. And some of them are excellent teachers, please, let's be very clear on that. And some of them are really inspiring teachers who are putting a lot of energy and love and in their work. But we now have the opportunity, because we understand so much more about learning, for instance, all the research that has been done in the last few years about learning and how to best support learning. These are the things that we need to bring in also in our teacher education programs to ensure that our teachers, so as far as it is possible, will be able to teach in any circumstances and in any context. So we need to work on preparing the agile teachers and the versatile teachers who would be able to be sensitive to context on the one hand and understand what is needed now, but to also always have a future vision.
Thank you. There are several comments here, but I'm aware of the time. I don't know if anybody has a burning question, comment to make before I wrap up.
I'd like to ask a question.
Is this
Don
Jen?
Hariprasad?
Oh, okay.
Don Hariprasad. Look, I'm not sure, perhaps maybe in all of the deliberations thus far, I think in my experience in managing education, I'm asking the question perhaps maybe to Charles, who's done extensive research and development around this area. Look, I'm of the opinion that there hasn't much changes taken place structurally in terms of how education systems or organizations have been structured to facilitate the change. We want to have a curriculum change, but structurally we as an organization is structured in a particular way, and that to a large extent will not allow any change to take place because you're going to go back to what is existing for hundreds of years. For example, the classroom hasn't changed. It's still a block where there's a classroom with a chalkboard and a teacher in front of it. So you're talking about curriculum change leading towards the development of competencies would require some thinking around how we structurally organize to be able to meet this change. And unless we go and do some work around how are we structurally organized? For example, we as an education system across all levels is obsessed with subject disciplines, but yet we're looking for an integration of the knowledge and skills and competencies which each subject discipline should actually provide. Similarly, if you take all levels of the system, in my experience, I think it's a big barrier for us to be able to have any systemic change. So therefore, I think there must be a lot more done. Aside, I mean, we can go and redesign the curriculum and bring it into a competency-based framework and bring in new pedagogies and methodologies and what have you. But unless we structurally not going to change to accommodate those new systems or the new approaches, the chances are that we'll still fall back into what used to be the common practice, where a learner sits in front of a teacher and the teacher is talking maths. Then he goes into another class, he's talking science. Then he goes into another group, he's talking another subject. But yet, all of these subjects are supposed to be integrating to be able to build the competencies in that learner for the future skill sets that you want. So I can tell you now that maybe there must be a lot more thought around how we structurally organized. You know, if you take organizational development as a discipline, they tell you that an organization is structured to meet its function. And if you're going to look at how have we structured ourselves over the last 50 years, it hasn't changed. So therefore, I would like to advise that maybe some experience that you have around that.
Well, thank you. So thank you, Don. I'll be happy to answer you. You brought several different points at the same time, if I may try to unpack them. The issue of overall structure, I'm less faced by that than you might think, meaning you still need a place for the kids during the day. You're not going to keep them at home, COVID excluded, right? When people say, look, the classroom looks the same as it was 100 years ago, we're like, so what? You still need tables and chairs, you know, the same way that corporations still need tables and chairs. So don't slam the classroom because it looks like 100 years ago. Companies look like 100 years ago with the difference of a computer on a table. Big deal, it's still a table and a chair. So that sort of thing about the classroom itself doesn't faze me. Sure, you can have, you know, different arrangements, but these are small aspects. The bigger aspect, of course, is about how do you teach better in a more collaborative way, in a more project-y sort of way. But to do that, again, it's not enormous change. What you need is free up several blocks of time where you have multidisciplinary projects going on, like the Zika example I gave. It's a simulation in math that can work with the biology teacher and the social sciences teacher. But you still need the basic math to be able to do that simulation. So it's a blend of, let's say, 25% interdisciplinary, 75% didactic, subject specific. It's not everything goes, everything gets, you don't rotate the matrix all at once. That's why the IBE framework, as Sarah was pointing out, cannot work if it's only about rotating from subject centricity to competency centricity. Even we do not propose that. We know that the world is organized around disciplines, and it's not a bad thing. It's a question of how to make it more porous between disciplines, is how to have a certain balance, an end curve between what's wise versus what's extreme in one direction or another. Are there other issues such as school leadership, etc., that need to be fixed? Absolutely. Perhaps that's what you mean also by structurally. And you're right that all of these things can be fixed, but it's like a chain. It will snap at the weakest point. But right now, the first part of the chain is so wrong that everything else is immaterial. So we first start there, and then we fix the assessments, and then we fix this, and when we fix the professional development. That's what is required. And I don't mean this strictly in a serial way, but in a staggered way, right? At some point, it will be time to start the development of the restructuring, but not necessarily up front, because it's a waste of time if things are still taught the way they are. Lastly, assessments. If there is one structural impediment to change, it is the end of schooling assessments, the summative assessments that all countries have. Because unwittingly or not, they're dictating backward everything that we teach in K-12. For those few who get to university, everything is biased. So for the other two types of job categories, everyone has to suffer through the same algebra, everyone has to endure the same system. That, if there's one locus that requires change, that is it. The baccalaureate equivalent in every country.
Thank you. I'm going
I could
to
add quickly to that, if you don't mind, Prof. Volming.
Sarah, can I give you
Yes,
the last word? I will give you the last word to get, and then Charles. But let me just add in something so that we can wrap up. I'm just concerned about people's time. I see it's already past 4. And then Sarah, I'll give you a chance. But you know, from where I sit here and I read some of the comments and I listen to the hearts of some of the people, it seems like we're going to have more courageous conversations around this issue of curriculum and it's going to take courage on both sides. But I hear a lot of concerns raised about our context, and several people have commented both verbally and in writing about the context of poverty. And I think that we need to have a discussion around this so that we understand. For me, like many others, poverty is the inability to participate in society with dignity. And if you understand that, if that's, you accept that as a working definition of poverty, then there are books on my bookshelf here. One is called Teaching with Poverty in Mind. And the other one is A Mind Shaped by Poverty. And you know, it is a particular challenge in this country where kids are falling down pit latrines. How are we going to embrace some of these very powerful ideas? And there were many that came up today. So over to you, Sarah, and then the last word from Charles.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Charles said, and it will also be my second last word. Charles, I agree fully with Charles. We don't, for instance, need to throw out CAPS, our current curriculum. I think we need to trim some of the content in the curriculum. And yes, it is quite possible you continue with disciplinary knowledge, your curriculum around disciplinary knowledge, infusing these competencies, as we said before, in the teaching of the knowledge. And then you could have, for instance, as Charles said, project-based learning, let's say for 25% of your time in your school, where you have then the possibility of integrating. So it's not throwing out the baby with the bathwater and say we must now radically rethink everything that we've been doing before. And then my last point then is to add to what you said, Prof. Volming. It's a point that I've also been making in the Faculty of Education, is we don't do enough in teacher education to understand poverty and its impact on teaching and learning. And that is something that we really need to explore in depth in our teacher education programs in South Africa. So we need to hold two things simultaneously. We need to look at our current reality and the complexities of this reality, but we must also not be blinded by this reality, because we also want to enable visions and enable how we can take our children forward from the current context in which they are into another possibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Last word, Charles.
Oh, thank you. You know, I studied engineering. In engineering, you quickly realize that you have to have the courage to say what's wrong, because otherwise the rocket explodes, the satellite slams into Mars, just because you didn't dare tell Lockheed, didn't dare have a conversation with NASA about whether they were using the metric system or the English system. So I have this luxury of being my own boss, and I can say things the way they are. I don't have political pressures on me from anybody. So with the engineering mindset, I can say things bluntly, the way they should be addressed courageously. So here are my 2 points. First of all, what we're seeing around the world is a consequence of not having acted on population hypergrowth. All countries, all humanity is guilty of having neglected to pay attention to the Club of Rome in the 60s and poo-pooed the result as, see, we're not all starving. Yeah, but we have destroyed everything in the meantime. We're swimming in plastic inside of us, etc. So we have not reined in population. Now we have 10 billion people to worry about rather than one, and the problems are exponentially harder when you have to deal with 10 billion people. Second, the other part of political courage that we don't see. Politicians, when they are elected for a short period of time. They don't want to spend a 20-year process to reshape things. They want to give someone a glitzy piece of technology and say, see, I've solved the education problem in my country. They all have an iPad or equivalent. That's unacceptable, but that's where we find time and time again a quick fix solution just to make politicians look good, rather than a stability at the tiller for a generation to make this change stick, irrespective of the politicians, the political parties in power, and so on. Unfortunately, that's what autocracies like Singapore and Korea at the time were able to put in place. But democracies like Finland have been able to put in place, but they're homogeneous. So it's a lot easier to do things when you're either autocratic or homogeneous than when you are democratic and heterogeneous. South Africa is democratic and heterogeneous. So are a number of other countries, the US and others. That's a lot tougher to do, but look at the examples of New Zealand, Australia, Canada. They are the shining star in this, let's say, Commonwealth sphere of mindsets, roughly speaking. I think they should be the ones taken as examples. And similarly with, well, no, that's it. These are the ones that could be taken as examples about how to do things better. But they also have a much easier time. Their population is significantly smaller.
Well, thank you, Charles. That's
courage.
Yeah. Yes.
Courage is a word.
But it's a good point to end this first dialogue seminar in this new world post-COVID. Well, we're not quite post-COVID yet, but it would certainly help us to enter this world with greater courage. And I want to say thank you to you, Charles, to Sarah Gravett for excellent inputs, and also to the three respondents. To mention the questions that we have recorded this discussion beyond today, but it was a good platform from which to relaunch and reimagine where we are going as a country in terms of education, with particular reference to the curriculum. I very much like what the three respondents have said, also Mr. Tlabani, Anil Kanji, and Arun Mohammed. I've made copious notes here, but we can't respond to everything given the time. So thank you, one and all. Charles, thank you for sharing this time with us. At least you don't have to travel all the way home 20 hours, but we really appreciate your input. Sarah Gravett, thank you so much for your insightful comments and input. And one and all, thank you. We will be in touch again very soon.
Thank you all, and best of luck.
Thank you, Charles.
John, thank you, Charles, and thank you, colleagues.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Lemon.